If I offered you a menu featuring bug eggs, blue pond scum, and a frothy bitter chocolate drink mixed with chili, you'd probably walk out of the restaurant. But 500 years ago, that was a feast fit for an emperor. It all starts with one trick they did to corn. Corn was everything to the Aztecs, but raw corn had a deadly secret. If you live off plain corn and nothing else, you slowly fall apart. Your skin cracks, your gut fails, your mind goes, and eventually, you die. That disease has a name, pellagra, and it killed people across Europe and the American South for centuries. So why didn't it wipe out the Aztecs, who ate corn at basically every meal? Because they figured out something Europe completely missed. They soaked their corn in water mixed with ash or lime. It sounds like nothing, but that one step changes the corn at a chemical level. It frees up a vitamin called niacin that's otherwise trapped inside the kernel, and it makes the protein far more usable by your body. The process is called Nixtamalization, and the oldest tools tied to it go back roughly 3,200 years. One food historian, Sophie Coe, argued this single invention was so important that you could see the entire rise of Mesoamerican civilization as a result of it. And that corn became the tortilla and the tamale. Here's the part that'll mess with you. When the Spanish took corn back to Europe, they grabbed the plant but completely ignored the soaking trick. Therefore, people who switched to a corn-only diet started dying of pellagra, the exact disease the Aztecs had quietly beaten thousands of years earlier. They had the food, but not the knowledge, and that gap cost real lives well into the 20th century. The soaked corn got ground on a stone slab into a dough, then patted flat, and cooked into tortillas, or wrapped up and steamed into tamales. And the tamales weren't basic. The records describe them stuffed with turkey, with fish, with frog, with beans, with fruit, even with no filling at all. Some were sweet with honey, some loaded with chili. Women would stay up 2 or 3 full days before a wedding just cooking them, but corn never worked alone because it had 2 partners that made the whole plate complete. The corn had 2 secret partners on the plate. The Aztecs ate corn, beans, and squash together, and there's real genius in why they pair so well. The corn gives you energy, the beans give you the protein that corn is missing, and the squash rounds it out with vitamins, while its seeds got roasted and eaten too. 3 foods that fix each other's weak spots. People later called them the 3 sisters, and together they gave you almost everything a human body needs to survive. But corn was just the beginning, because they had a 4th crop, and the Spanish feared it. That 4th crop was amaranth. Amaranth was a tiny grain that ranked second only to corn, and the numbers behind it are wild. Under the Emperor Moctezuma II, something like 20,000 tons of amaranth poured into the capital every single year as tribute. That's almost as much as the corn tribute, but it wasn't the amount that scared the Spanish. It was what the Aztecs did with it. During one sacred festival, they'd toast the amaranth, mix it with honey, and in some accounts, with sacrificial blood. Then, they shaped that dough into a giant idol of their war god. They'd parade it through the city, break it apart, and eat the pieces. To the Spanish priests watching, this looked way too much like their own Holy Communion, the body being shared and eaten. Therefore, they tried to stamp amaranth out completely. They failed, and you can still buy it today as a sweet candy called alegría, which means joy. But the Aztecs had one more seed in their pocket, and you've probably eaten it this week. You already know the next one. It's chia. You heard that exact chia, the same seeds in your overpriced smoothie, were a staple grain for Aztec warriors 500 years ago. The Nahuatl name basically means oily, and soldiers carried chia as fuel because a small amount kept them going for a long time. They soaked it in water with a little chili, and it swelled into a thick, filling drink for the road. But grains and seeds were only half the plate because the Aztecs were obsessed with flavor, and one ingredient ran the whole show. Now we get to the ingredient they couldn't live without, the chili. The Aztecs put chilies on nearly everything, and the variety is almost comical. The old records from the priest Sahagún describe a chili seller offering mild red ones, broad ones, hot green ones, yellow ones, smoked ones, thin ones, tree chilies, water chilies, and a dozen more smoked chilies. By the way, are exactly what we now call chipotle. So when you order a chipotle anything, you're ordering a 500-year-old Aztec technique. Chilies were so serious, they crossed into religion. When priests were fasting, they gave up two things, and one of them was chili. That's how central the heat was to daily life. But chilies needed something to go with, and that's where the base of every modern salsa was born. Therefore, the salsa you love is older than you think. The Aztecs took tomatoes and the little green husk tomato we call the tomatillo. They crushed them together with chili and made a sauce. The records literally describe these chili and tomato sauces sold ready to eat. That right there is salsa. That's the direct ancestor of mole. You're eating a recipe that predates the fall of the empire. Throw in the avocado, which they called aguacatl, and mashed into an early guacamole, plus the prickly pear cactus they ate pads and fruit from, and you basically have a modern Mexican plate forming 5 centuries ago. But before we leave the plants, there's a question worth asking. With no sugarcane, how did they make anything sweet? However, they had no sugar, so how did they sweeten their food? The Aztecs got their sweetness from 3 clever places. They tapped the agave plant for its sap, called honey water, and boiled it down into a thick syrup. They kept stingless bees for real honey, and they mixed that honey with toasted amaranth and seeds to make sweet treats. Salt was just as clever. They had no easy salt mines near the capital, so they scraped up the salty soil at the lake's edge, washed it into a strong brine, then boiled the water off until only salt crystals were left. Simple tools, smart chemistry. But now, we leave the plants behind because the protein is where it gets strange. And this is where the menu gets wild, starting with the meat. The Aztecs had almost no big farm animals. No cows, no pigs, no sheep, none of it. Their 2 main domesticated meats were the turkey. And this is the part that stops people. A small dog. They raised a hairless breed, the one we now call the Zolo, and they ate it, often served right alongside turkey at feasts. The Spanish reportedly loved the taste so much, they nearly wiped the breed out. But here's a detail that quietly corrects the old stories. When you dig up Aztec sites, deer bones often dominate. In some places, over 90% of the animal remains, so venison was likely a much bigger meat source than the dog meat the shocked Spanish loved to write about. Still, the land animals weren't the real treasure. The treasure was the lake. The real feast came out of the water. The Aztec capital sat on a lake, and that lake was a buffet. They pulled out fish, frogs, water snakes, shrimp, and huge flocks of ducks they knocked down with darts. They also ate the axolotl, that strange smiling salamander the internet adores today. The Aztecs put it in tamales with yellow chili and considered it genuinely good eating. But 2 foods from that lake are so unexpected that most people refuse to believe they're real. The first one is basically Mexican caviar made from bugs. Out on the water lived a tiny insect, and its eggs got skimmed off the lake's surface in massive amounts. That egg harvest was called ahuatle, and it was prized so highly, people nicknamed it Mexican caviar. You read that correctly. They were eating insect eggs as a delicacy, the way the rich eat fish eggs now. And if bug caviar didn't get you, the next lake food definitely will, because it's green and it's alive. The second lake food was blue-green pond scum. Floating on that same lake was a blue-green algae, and the Aztecs scooped it up, dried it into cakes, and ate it like a savory snack. Sahagún described gathering the scum. spreading it out to dry, then toasting it. But here's the part nobody sees coming. That algae is what we now sell as spirulina, the trendy superfood powder in health stores worldwide. The Aztecs were eating it off a lake 500 years before it hit your supplement shelf. And insects weren't just a lake thing. They were on land too, by choice. Speaking of insects, they ate those by choice. Grasshoppers, which they ate then and Mexico still eats now as chapulines, are no joke nutritionally. Lab analysis of the actual grasshopper species eaten in Mexico found crude protein around 60% of its dry weight. They also ate Eskimos, the larvae of ants, a dish whose name basically translates to ant stew, and they ate maguey worms, straight off the agave plant. To them, this wasn't survival food. It was good food, full stop, but humans need to drink too. And the Aztec drinks were just as loaded with meaning. Now let's talk about the drink that doubled as money, chocolate. Forget the sweet candy bar. Aztec chocolate was a cold, bitter, foamy drink made from ground cacao beans, water, chili, and sometimes vanilla. They poured it back and forth between cups from a height to whip up a thick foam on top, and that foam was the best part. But here's what's hard to wrap your head around. The cacao beans weren't just a drink. They were literally cash. We have an actual price list written in 1545, and it's incredible. One cacao bean could buy you one large tomato. A turkey egg cost 3 beans. A small rabbit ran you 30 beans. A full-grown turkey hen, 100 beans. So a person could quite literally drink their money or save it and buy dinner. And because cacao couldn't grow in the cold highlands of the capital, every single bean had to be traded or shipped in from far away, which made it a luxury of the rich and the warriors. But chocolate wasn't the only famous Aztec drink, and the next one could get you killed. However, the next drink could get you executed. There was a fermented drink made from the sap of the agave plant called pulque, and the Aztecs took it deadly seriously. It had its own goddess and its own gang of drunkenness gods known as the 400 Rabbits. Regular people couldn't just crack one open whenever they wanted. It was mostly reserved for the elderly, for priests, for warrior, and for specific sacred occasions. So what happened if you got drunk in public when you weren't allowed? For a first offense, they'd shave your head in front of everyone as public shame. Keep doing it, or do it as a nobleman who should know better. And the punishment could be death. The one group that got a free pass was the elderly, often said to be those over 70 who'd earned the right to drink as much as they liked. But pulque and chocolate were the special stuff. So what did a normal person actually sip every single day? And the everyday drink was atole, the one nobody talks about. For most Aztecs, the daily drink was atole, a warm gruel made from that same nixtamalized corn, thinned with water until you could sip it. It filled you up. It was cheap, and it worked for breakfast or a long day's work. They'd jazz it up with chili, with honey, with fruit, or with a little cacao when they could afford it. The kids got theirs plain. The adults got theirs spicy. There was also pinole, toasted corn ground into a sweet powder you could mix with water on the move. So between atole, pinole, chocolate, and pulque, the Aztecs had a drink for every person, every mood, and every occasion. But who got to eat the good stuff? And who lived on the basics? And that depended entirely on whether you were rich or poor. For a regular Aztec, daily food was simple and repeated almost every day. Tortillas, bean, a bit of squash, chili, some cactus, and bugs when they could catch them. Meat and stuffed tamales were a treat saved for feast days, not a Tuesday dinner. It filled the belly and kept people working. But it wasn't fancy. The nobles, though, lived in a completely different food world. They had the imported cacao, the wide range of meats, the tropical fruit hauled in from warmer lands, and cooks who knew how to turn all of it into proper dishes. Above all of them sat the emperor, whose meals became legend. According to the soldier Bernal Diaz, who claimed he saw it with his own eyes, Moctezuma's cooks prepared more than 30 different dishes for him at a single sitting. The spread is said to have included turkey, quail, duck, venison, rabbit, and fish, all kept warm over little clay heaters, so nothing went cold. He sipped his foamy chocolate from gold cups, while performers entertained him. Now, that account was written from memory decades later, so smart historians take the giant numbers with a grain of salt. But even the careful version describes a feast almost nobody alive today will ever sit down to. So how did all this food actually come together into the dishes we'd recognize? Because a lot of it became dishes you'd still order today. Here's the wild part. Strip away 500 years, and the Aztec plate isn't that far from a modern Mexican menu. You've got the tortilla, still the base of everything. You've got the tamale, still wrapped and steamed the same way. You've got salsa, born from that chili and tomato mash. You've got guacamole, from mashed avocado. You've got the turkey, the beans, the squash, the chili in every form, and chocolate as a drink. Even the chapulines and the Eskimos are still served in parts of Mexico as proud regional dishes, not as a dare. The empire fell, but the food refused to die. It just changed hands, picked up a few new ingredients from the Spanish, like pork and cheese, and kept going. When you put it all together, the Aztec table was one of the richest and strangest in human history. They cracked a corn secret that saved millions of lives, turned chocolate into currency, ate algae we now call a superfood, and built a whole cuisine that still feeds the world today. The next time you bite into a tortilla or scoop up some salsa, remember, you're tasting an empire that vanished 500 years ago. If you learned something new today, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.